April 12, 1945, near Weimar, Germany. The compound smells of disinfectant and damp wool. 37 German nurses sit in rows on wooden benches, their grey-blue uniforms stained with mud and old blood. Outside, American trucks rumble past. Inside, silence hangs heavy. They have been prisoners for 6 hours. Greta Hoffmann sits with her hands folded in her lap. She is 24 years old. She has worked in field hospitals from Stalingrad to the Ardennes. She has amputated limbs without anesthesia. She has held dying men as they called for their mothers. She expects interrogation, perhaps imprisonment, perhaps worse. An American woman enters. She wears the uniform of the Army Nurse Corps, crisp, clean, impossibly white. She carries a wooden crate. She sets it down and begins distributing its contents. Lipstick. Small metal tubes in shades of red and pink. She places one in Greta's hand. The gesture is gentle, almost casual. Greta stares at it. Her fingers tremble. She hasn't worn lipstick in 3 years. She hasn't thought about wearing lipstick in 3 years. She looks up at the American nurse, searching for mockery, for cruelty. She finds only a tired smile. Greta begins to cry. In the Third Reich, women serve the war machine in carefully defined roles. The Nazi ideology proclaimed Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, as the proper sphere for German womanhood. Yet as the war consumed millions of men, pragmatism overruled propaganda. By 1939, the Wehrmacht desperately needed medical personnel. Women were recruited, trained, and deployed to military hospitals across occupied Europe. The Schwesternschaft, Nursing Sisterhood, became one of the largest female organizations in wartime Germany. Over 500,000 women served as nurses, nursing auxiliaries, and medical assistants. They were not officially part of the military. They held no rank. They wore distinctive grey-blue uniforms with the Red Cross emblem, a status meant to protect them under international law. In practice, that protection eroded as the war ground on. Their training was rigorous and ideological. Nursing schools taught medicine alongside Nazi racial theory. Students learned to dress wounds and to identify undesirable patients. They were instructed in proper hygiene and proper loyalty to the Führer. The ideal German nurse was competent, selfless, and racially conscious, a caregiver who understood that some lives were more valuable than others. By 1943, these women worked under conditions that would have been unimaginable in peacetime. They staffed field hospitals mere kilometers from the front lines. They performed surgery in bunkers during artillery barrages. They treated frostbite in unheated tents on the Eastern Front. As Germany's industrial capacity crumbled, medical supplies vanished. Morphine became scarce. Sulfur drugs ran out. Bandages were boiled and reused until they fell apart. Personal items disappeared entirely. Soap became a luxury. Clean uniforms were rarities. Cosmetics, lipstick, powder, perfume were frivolous memories from another life. The Reich needed every resource for the war effort. Vanity was weakness. Sacrifice was virtue. These nurses were told they were serving the most advanced, most powerful nation on earth. They were told the enemy was degenerate, weak, and cruel. They were told that, if Germany fell, they would face brutality at the hands of the Allies. As the Western Front collapsed in early 1945, tens of thousands of German medical personnel found themselves in the path of the American advance. In the Third Reich, women served the war machine in carefully defined roles. The Nazi ideology proclaimed Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, as the proper sphere for German womanhood. Yet as the war consumed millions of men, pragmatism overruled propaganda. By 1939, the Wehrmacht desperately needed medical personnel. Women were recruited, trained, and deployed to military hospitals across occupied Europe. The Schwesternschaft, Nursing Sisterhood, became one of the largest female organizations in wartime Germany. Over 500,000 women served as nurses, nursing auxiliaries, and medical assistants. They were not officially part of the military. They held no rank. They wore distinctive grey-blue uniforms with the Red Cross emblem, a status meant to protect them under international law. In practice, that protection eroded as the war ground on. Their training was rigorous and ideological. Nursing schools taught medicine alongside Nazi racial theory. Students learned to dress wounds and to identify undesirable patients. They were instructed in proper hygiene and proper loyalty to the Führer. The ideal German nurse was competent, selfless, and racially conscious, a caregiver who understood that some lives were more valuable than others. By 1943, these women worked under conditions that would have been unimaginable in peacetime. They staffed field hospitals mere kilometers from the front lines. They performed surgery in bunkers during artillery barrages. They treated frostbite in unheated tents on the Eastern Front. As Germany's industrial capacity crumbled, medical supplies vanished. Morphine became scarce. Sulfur drugs ran out. Bandages were boiled and reused until they fell apart. Personal items disappeared entirely. Soap became a luxury. Clean uniforms were rarities. Cosmetics, lipstick, powder, perfume were frivolous memories from another life. The Reich needed every resource for the war effort. Vanity was weakness. Sacrifice was virtue. These nurses were told they were serving the most advanced, most powerful nation on earth. They were told the enemy was degenerate, weak, and cruel. They were told that, if Germany fell, they would face brutality at the hands of the Allies. As the Western Front collapsed in early 1945, tens of thousands of German medical personnel found themselves in the path of the American advance. The American forces rolling into Germany in the spring of 1945 brought with them a military culture fundamentally different from what the German nurses had been taught to expect. The United States Army operated under strict codes regarding the treatment of prisoners of war and captured medical personnel. The Geneva Conventions provided clear guidelines. Medical staff were to be retained only as long as necessary for the care of POWs, then repatriated. They were to be treated with respect, provided adequate housing, food, and supplies. But American policy went further than legal minimums. The US military understood the propaganda value of humane treatment. Every German prisoner who returned home with stories of decent treatment undermined Goebbels' narrative of allied barbarism. Every nurse who experienced kindness instead of cruelty became a living contradiction to Nazi ideology. The American Army Nurse Corps played a crucial role in this strategy. Over 59,000 American women served as military nurses during World War II. Unlike their German counterparts, they held officer rank with corresponding pay and privileges. They were respected professionals within the military hierarchy, treated as equals to male officers of equivalent rank. Many had never experienced the subordination that defined life for women in Nazi Germany. These American nurses brought with them something German women had not seen in years: abundance. The United States had not been bombed. Its factories ran at full capacity. Its supply lines stretched unbroken across the Atlantic. American military personnel received regular shipments of not just necessities, but comforts, cigarettes, chocolate, soap, and yes, cosmetics. The US military issued cosmetics to female personnel as part of standard supply allotments. This wasn't frivolity. It was policy rooted in morale and dignity. The reasoning was simple. Maintaining personal appearance maintained psychological health. Women who felt human were more effective at their jobs. The military supplied lipstick for the same reason it supplied toothpaste, because taking care of oneself mattered. When American forces began capturing German medical facilities in March and April 1945, they found exhausted women who had been working without relief for months, women who hadn't bathed properly in weeks, women who wore the same blood-stained uniforms day after day because replacements didn't exist, women who had forgotten what it felt like to be anything other than a tool of the state. The Americans saw an opportunity, not just for intelligence gathering or propaganda, but for something simpler and more profound, demonstrating through action what their society valued. They could tell these German women that democracy respected human dignity, or they could show them So they gave them lipstick. Angle 1. The ideology gap. Two visions of womanhood. Lipstick represented more than cosmetics. It represented two incompatible philosophies about women's place in wartime society. Nazi ideology had stripped femininity down to function. Women existed to produce soldiers, care for soldiers, and sacrifice for soldiers. Personal adornment was selfish. Beauty was secondary to duty. The regime had campaigned against cosmetics as decadent and Western, promoting instead the image of the wholesome German mother, scrubbed clean, unadorned, naturally healthy. In practice, this meant German women had been conditioned to view self-care as betrayal. To want lipstick was to want something for yourself, and wanting anything for yourself when the right needed everything was moral failure. Nurses who had once enjoyed fashion and makeup had learned to suppress those desires. They had internalized the message, vanity is weakness. American military culture operated from a different premise. Personal dignity wasn't opposed to duty. It enabled duty. A woman could be both a competent professional and someone who cared about her appearance. These concepts weren't contradictory. They were complementary. The American nurses who distributed lipstick weren't ignoring the war. They were acknowledging that the women receiving care were human beings, not just defeated enemies. The German nurses couldn't process this immediately. Years of propaganda had taught them that Americans were materialistic and shallow, obsessed with superficial pleasures, while lacking German discipline and depth. Yet here were American women who had crossed an ocean to serve in a war, who worked in field hospitals under fire, who held the same medical skills, and who still found time to care about lipstick. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Either the propaganda had been entirely wrong, or there was something these American women understood that Nazi ideology had deliberately obscured. That maintaining humanity in war required more than just survival. It required remembering who you were before the war and who you wanted to be after it. Angle 2. Material reality. The abundance gap. Lipstick wasn't just symbolic. It was evidence of material disparity so vast it bordered on incomprehensible. Germany in April 1945 was starving. Cities lay in ruins. Supply chains had collapsed. The population survived on ration cards that promised food the government couldn't deliver. Soap was hoarded. Fabric was precious. Anything non-essential had vanished years ago. The American military operated in a different economic universe. Its logistics network delivered millions of tons of supplies across thousands of miles. Its soldiers received care packages from home. Its bases had PX stores where personnel could buy items that hadn't existed in German shops since 1942. The Americans had so much surplus, they could afford to give enemy prisoners luxury items. For the German nurses, the lipstick was proof of something they had been told was impossible. America wasn't collapsing. It wasn't stretched thin. It wasn't barely holding on. The enemy had enough resources to care about whether captured nurses felt pretty. That realization carried implications about who was truly winning this war. Implications that made years of sacrifice feel suddenly, devastatingly futile. Angle 3. Femininity under fire. What the gesture meant in the psychology of captivity. Small gestures carry enormous weight. The German nurses had spent the final months of the war in a state of progressive dehumanization. They had become functions, medics who cleaned wounds, administered morphine, held basins during surgery. Their own needs evaporated. Sleep became sporadic. Meals became whatever could be grabbed between casualties. Personal grooming became washing blood off hands. The loss of femininity wasn't just about appearance. It was about identity. These women had been daughters, sisters, friends. They had once cared about how they looked, what they wore, how they presented themselves to the world. The war had stripped that away layer by layer until only the nurse remained. The person underneath was forgotten. When an American nurse handed Greta Hoffmann that tube of lipstick, she wasn't just giving her cosmetics. She was acknowledging that a person still existed beneath the uniform. That Greta wasn't just a captured enemy medic. She was a young woman who had once enjoyed feeling attractive, who might want to feel that way again. The gesture said, "You are still human. You are still a woman. You are still worth this small kindness. Many German nurses broke down when they received lipstick, not from gratitude. Gratitude would come later. They cried from recognition, from the sudden, overwhelming awareness of how much they had lost, not just in the war's final collapse, but gradually over years of being told their personal needs didn't matter. Angle 4. The power of unexpected Merkanazi propaganda had prepared these women for brutality. The regime's own treatment of captured Soviet medical personnel had been savage. Many were shot, others worked to death, some starved in camps. The Germans assumed the Americans would reciprocate. At minimum, they expected harsh interrogation, poor conditions, and contemptuous treatment. Instead, they received lipstick. The psychological impact of kindness, where cruelty was expected, cannot be overstated. It shattered assumptions. It forced re-evaluation. If the Americans weren't the barbarians described in propaganda, what else had been lies? If the enemy showed more humanity than their own officers often had, what did that say about the cause they'd served? The lipstick became a wedge that split open years of indoctrination. It was a small thing, a tube of colored wax worth perhaps 50 cents, but it arrived at the precise moment when these women were most vulnerable, most uncertain, most open to having their worldview transformed. The Americans understood this, whether through deliberate psychological operations or simple human decency. They had found the perfect tool to demonstrate that their system valued something the Reich had abandoned: individual human dignity. April 15, 1945, a converted schoolhouse near Eora. Captain Margaret Hastings of the Army Nurse Corps had been briefed on the assignment before she entered the building. 63 German nurses and medical auxiliaries were being held there, awaiting processing. They had been captured when American troops overran a Wehrmacht field hospital 3 days earlier. Intelligence wanted them interviewed. Medical command wanted them checked for disease. No one had mentioned what they actually needed. Margaret saw it immediately when she walked in. These weren't the fanatical Nazis of propaganda posters. They were exhausted young women wearing filthy uniforms that hadn't been changed in weeks. Their hair was matted. Their hands showed cuts and chemical burns from disinfectants. Several had infections from treating patients in unsanitary conditions. One girl, she couldn't have been older than 19, had a hollow look Margaret recognized from trauma patients. The Germans stiffened when she entered. Their eyes tracked her with animal wariness. They expected something. Margaret couldn't tell if it was violence, humiliation, or simply more orders. What they clearly didn't expect was for her to smile. She had brought medical supplies, bandages, sulfur powder, soap. She had also brought something from her own footlocker: cosmetics, lipstick, face powder, a few small mirrors, items her mother had sent in a care package, items she didn't particularly need, but had kept anyway, because they reminded her of home. She set the crate down and began distributing items through an interpreter. "You've been working hard. You deserve to feel human again." The first woman to receive a lipstick tube was Greta Hoffmann. She held it like it might explode. Margaret demonstrated, applying a touch of color to her own lips, then gesturing for Greta to try. Greta's hands shook as she twisted the base. The lipstick emerged, bright red, impossibly vibrant against the grey surroundings. She applied it carefully, almost reverently. Then she looked in the small mirror Margaret offered. What she saw made her gasp, not because she looked beautiful. She was still haggard, still exhausted, still a prisoner in a defeated nation, but because for the first time in 3 years, she saw herself as something other than a function of the state. Around the room, other women received their tubes. Some applied the lipstick immediately. Others clutched them like talismans, too overwhelmed to use them. One woman, an older nurse named Helga Richter, tried to refuse. "We don't deserve this," she said in broken English. "We are enemies." Margaret crouched beside her. "You're nurses, same as me. That matters more than the uniform." Helga took the lipstick. She held it against her chest and wept. Word spread through the prisoner network with astonishing speed. By evening, nurses in nearby compounds had heard about the lipstick. By the next day, German medical personnel awaiting processing were asking American guards if the story was true. Within a week, it had become legend, proof that capture didn't mean death, that the Americans were different, that survival was possible. The intelligence officers noticed the shift immediately. German nurses who had been silent during initial questioning became cooperative, not because they were coerced, but because the lipstick had broken something inside their resistance, the belief that helping their captors would bring only harm. If the Americans cared enough to give them cosmetics, perhaps they could be trusted with information that might save German lives. Lieutenant Emma Fischer had been part of a surgical team near Kassel. She had refused to provide details about German medical infrastructure, citing her duty as a non-combatant protected under Geneva Conventions. After receiving soap, clean clothing, and a tube of pink lipstick from an American nurse, she requested another interview. She provided locations of hospital trains, evacuation routes for wounded, and the names of medical officers who might be willing to negotiate surrenders of isolated units. Her reasoning was simple: you gave us dignity. Perhaps you will give them mercy. The intelligence officers noticed the shift immediately. German nurses who had been silent during initial questioning became cooperative, not because they were coerced, but because the lipstick had broken something inside their resistance, the belief that helping their captors would bring only harm. If the Americans cared enough to give them cosmetics, perhaps they could be trusted with information that might save German lives. Lieutenant Emma Fischer had been part of a surgical team near Kassel. She had refused to provide details about German medical infrastructure, citing her duty as a non-combatant protected under Geneva Conventions. After receiving soap, clean clothing, and a tube of pink lipstick from an American nurse, she requested another interview. She provided locations of hospital trains, evacuation routes for wounded, and the names of medical officers who might be willing to negotiate surrenders of isolated units. Her reasoning was simple: you gave us dignity. Perhaps you will give them mercy. The pattern repeated across dozens of camps. German medical personnel who received humane treatment became advocates for cooperation. They wrote letters to colleagues still serving in shrinking pockets of German-held territory. They recorded radio messages encouraging surrender. They provided intelligence that helped American forces avoid accidentally bombing hospitals and civilian medical facilities. The lipstick strategy, if it could even be called a strategy, achieved what interrogation rarely did. It transformed captives from hostile witnesses into willing participants in ending the war, not through force, but through the simple demonstration that their humanity was recognized. At the schoolhouse in Erfurt, Greta Hoffmann became an informal liaison between the American medical staff and German prisoners. She helped organize the processing of wounded German Poles, translating medical terminology and explaining treatment procedures to terrified patients who expected to be left to die. She worked 18-hour shifts, not because she was ordered to, but because the Americans had given her reason to believe her skills still mattered. On April 28, 2 weeks after receiving the lipstick, she asked Captain Hastings a question that had been building since that first moment. Why did you do it? The lipstick. You didn't have to. Margaret thought for a moment. My grandmother was a nurse in the First War. She told me that no matter what side you're on, nurses remember that everyone's someone's son, everyone's someone's daughter. The uniform doesn't change that. Greta nodded slowly. She had spent 3 years being told that some lives mattered more than others, that German blood was superior, that the enemy was subhuman. A tube of lipstick had done more to dismantle that worldview than any propaganda leaflet could have achieved. It wasn't just about the cosmetics. It was about being seen, about being treated as if her worth as a human being transcended the war, the ideology, the collapse of everything she had been taught to believe. That night, Greta Hoffmann wore lipstick for the first time since 1942. It was a small act of reclamation, a declaration that she was still alive, still herself, still capable of caring about something as simple and profound as feeling like a woman again. The immediate effects were measurable. By May 1945, Allied intelligence reports documented a marked increase in cooperation from captured German medical personnel particularly women. Interrogation officers noted that prisoners who received what the reports termed dignity-based treatment, including access to hygiene supplies, clean clothing, and personal items, were significantly more forthcoming than those held under standard but impersonal conditions. Medical officers observed psychological improvements as well. German nurses given the opportunity to maintain personal appearance showed lower rates of depression and post-traumatic symptoms. They ate better. They slept more consistently. They engaged more actively in their own care and the care of wounded German POWs. The simple act of restoring a sense of normalcy, even through something as minor as lipstick, had tangible mental health benefits. The policy spread. What began as individual acts of kindness by American nurses became semi-official procedure. Supply officers began requisitioning cosmetics specifically for distribution to female prisoners. Red Cross packages prepared for German POW camps included items like soap, combs, and occasionally makeup. The practice wasn't universal. Resources were limited. Priorities varied by unit. But it became common enough that German women learned to expect humane treatment rather than brutality. The propaganda value proved immense. German nurses repatriated to remaining Wehrmacht-held areas carried stories that contradicted Goebbels' narrative. Letters sent through neutral channels or Red Cross networks described American generosity. Some women who had been fanatical believers in National Socialism underwent profound ideological shifts. They didn't become instant Democrats, but the certainty that had sustained them through years of war crumbled when faced with enemies who treated them better than their own system often had. One documented case involved a nurse named Anneliese Bauer, captured near Nuremberg in April. She had been a dedicated party member, raised in the League of German Girls, convinced of Aryan superiority and Allied degeneracy. After 2 weeks in American custody, during which she received medical care for an infected wound, clean quarters, adequate food, and yes, a tube of lipstick from a black American nurse, she wrote to her sister still in Germany, "Everything we were told was backwards. They treat us like human beings. We treated others like animals. I don't know what to believe anymore." The long-term effects rippled through post-war Germany in ways both subtle and profound. As American occupation began, the women who had experienced capture carried with them a perspective most Germans lacked: direct, personal evidence that the occupiers were not monsters. They became informal ambassadors of pragmatism, encouraging cooperation and discouraging resistance. Greta Hoffmann returned to civilian life in Hamburg in late 1945. She found a city in ruins, a population traumatized, and widespread fear about what American occupation would mean. She spoke openly about her experience at community meetings, in breadlines, in the makeshift clinics where she volunteered. She told the same story. The Americans had given her lipstick. It became a shorthand for everything the gesture represented. That dignity would be respected. That revenge was not the occupation's purpose. That rebuilding was possible. Her testimony mattered. In the chaos of defeat, when rumors of mass executions and systematic rape circulated through terrified populations, the voices of women who had actually experienced American custody carried credibility. They couldn't promise the occupation would be easy or painless, but they could testify it wouldn't be the apocalypse Nazi propaganda had predicted. The contrast with Soviet-occupied zones made the message more powerful. German women fleeing westward brought stories of genuine horror from the East: mass sexual violence, arbitrary executions, brutal deportations. The difference in occupation policies became starkly apparent. American zones offered the possibility of recovery. The lipstick story, repeated and embellished, became symbolic of that difference. By 1946, American military government reports noted that former female POWs were among the most reliable cooperators in reconstruction efforts. They worked as translators, administrators, and liaisons between occupying forces and German civilians. Many, including Greta, eventually immigrated to the United States, sponsored by American nurses they had befriended during captivity. The lipstick itself became a treasured possession for many who received it. Some kept the empty tubes for decades. Others passed them down to daughters with the story attached. In museums documenting the occupation period, several such tubes survive, displayed alongside letters and photographs testifying to the moment when a small gesture of humanity pierced through years of indoctrination. The policy influence post-war military doctrine. Studies conducted in the late 1940s by army psychologists examine the effectiveness of dignity-based treatment of prisoners. Their findings: that small gestures of respect produce significant intelligence gains and facilitated cooperation, informed Cold War power policies, and prisoner handling protocols that remained in place for decades. Captain Margaret Hastings continued serving until 1946. She never wrote about the lipstick incident in official reports, considering it simply part of doing her job with basic human decency. Decades later, when interviewed for an oral history project, she remembered it clearly. "We gave them lipstick because we had lipstick to give," she said, "and because nurses take care of people. All people. That's the job. Wars are won with tanks and aircraft, with strategies and supply lines. But they are also won with gestures so small they barely register in the official histories. A tube of lipstick worth 50 cents accomplished what weapons could not. It reminded both giver and receiver that humanity persists even when nations destroy each other. The German nurses who received those cosmetics carried them as proof that the world they had been promised, one of absolute enemies and total war, was a lie. The American nurses who distributed them demonstrated that strength doesn't require cruelty, that victory doesn't demand dehumanization. Greta Hoffmann kept her lipstick tube until she died in 1998. It sat on her dresser in her home in Virginia, faded and empty, a relic from the moment her life changed. She told her grandchildren the story dozens of times, not about the war, not about the battles, not about the suffering, about the moment an enemy showed her more kindness than her own government ever had. In the rubble of history's most destructive conflict, in the shadow of genocide and atomic fire, a simple truth emerged: treating people with dignity costs almost nothing, but its value can topple ideologies and reshape the world. That's what a tube of lipstick taught the world in the spring of 1945. That humanity, once acknowledged, cannot be easily suppressed. That the smallest acts of mercy can echo across generations. That even in war, especially in war, how we treat each other defines who we truly are.